So political Zionism is basically the evolution. So when Theodor Herzl originally conceptualized this Jewish state, it was just that, it was a conceptualization. It was more of like an ideological notion more than like a political practice. But this started to change at the turn of the 20th century. And Zionism began to take the form of demanding that Jews have political rights and representation in Palestine during the Aliyot. And so one of the things that kind of like emphasizes this is very related to what you were asking about, right, where the British Mandate has a role in sort of enforcing this and protecting Zionism. In the case of the Balfour Declaration of 1917, it kind of delineates the rights and responsibilities of the occupants of Palestine. And in this document, in 1917, Jews at this time make up 10% of the population in Palestine. Already an artificial number, but 10% of the population. And the Balfour Declaration refers to the Palestinian population as the Jews and the non-Jews.
Yeah.
Refers to the indigenous Palestinians and Arabs as non-Jews, even though they were still 90%, they were still the majority of their own native land. So that kind of shows how the British, in having sort of the control over the political strings of this political movement, is able to facilitate, the notion of Jewish supremacy.
And I know I talked about this a little bit last time, but the date of the Balfour Declaration is really important because a lot of Jews at this time were involved in communist or social democratic parties, and by doing this declaration in 1917, it took a lot of the wind out of the sails of those Jewish parties and kind of pushed that emphasis away from socialism and towards Zionism.
On word of Balfour, I showed it at our last meeting. I actually opened up the document and showed you guys. For those of you who weren't here, it was a 67-word document that they took 2 years to write. And that document really did like that was like a deed, like, here, have the land, to the Zionists. And like, it's really important to keep referring back to that document and to see how intelligently the West used their vocab and diction to string together this it's two sentences of just bullshit. Just like, they refer to Palestinians as like the non-Jewish population. It's like they took the time to not say Arabs or Muslims or Palestinians or whatever else, Levantine even.
It's very like purposely non-specific and broad.
Exactly. And like, I pointed that out, it was just so vague, and it further cements, like, the more vague something is, the easier it is to manipulate and mandible, and like, just, it's so easy to move around.
That's actually something that has stayed true
Yeah.
throughout Zionism,
Yeah.
and even is reflected in David Ben-Gurion's writings and Jabotinsky's writings, is referring to Palestinians as Arabs. When you take away the name of Palestine, it helps erase Palestine.
It's just all about erasure.
And they also literally say, like, to this day, when I was in Israel, they said, like, oh yeah, there's no such thing as a Palestinian people. There was just like this ethnic mix of people that were kind of sort of in this land.
Yeah.
So that denial is sometimes not on the nose and sometimes very, very on the nose.
Yeah.
You hear today in 2018, a lot of people will try and defend Zionism by saying, "Oh, it's not colonialism."
Yeah.
Like, they'll claim that us saying that it's colonialism is an attack, but you can see that the founders of Zionism are very, very clear that Zionism is something colonial. And this stays true from the early 1900s through 1950s, 60s, so on. So if someone is ever like, "You know, you're settler colonialism," I don't know her. It's like, well, Theodor Herzl did, so I don't know about that.
Yeah, it's not a coincidence, and we need to keep paying attention to that, like, not just for the Palestinian cause, it's just like, oppressors really do work together and like use each other's tactics and documents and ways of writing to do the same things over and over and over.
This is really where the foundation of this idea of land without people for people without a land. This idea that Jews would come to Palestine and work the land. It was sort of the idea of the new Jewish man theory, where you're the strong agricultural type and you're working the land and therefore you're beholden to it, and vice versa. Some notable labor Zionists were David Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, who were both notable prime ministers of Israel. So it's interesting, right? So we're talking about Zionism, which is a very, very anti-liberatory ideology based in ethnic cleansing, based in genocide. But it actually had its roots in socialism, had its roots in Marxism. So Coalition was the Marxist Zionist party in Europe in the early 1900s. They were supportive of the Russian Revolution, so like Alon was alluding to the year 1917 being very important. That was the the year of the October Revolution. David Ben-Gurion characterized himself as a Bolshevik, right? Like they were very, very intrinsically tied with the growing Marxist, the growing communist movement in Eastern and Western Europe.
So it's actually funny, like I think the idea of a Marxist Zionist is a little bit oxymoronic because one is putting like class interest first and one is putting ethnic background first. But yeah, it was the idea of like creating a socialist state, not a socialist state, a labor state for Jews, only Jews. And I think, I can't remember who said it, but I think later on in the slides, somebody from the party is brought up, but the idea of like, people were given an option at this time. You could be a socialist and fight for the rights of everyone, or you can be a Zionist and fight for the rights of Jews.
So eventually there was a split in the Coalition. David Ben-Gurion became like the de facto leader of the Social Democratic faction, and was, like openly socially democratic as the Prime Minister of Israel. In this position, he accepted the partition plan. It was very explicitly clear. Some Zionists today will say, Jews in good faith, they accepted the partition plan. Palestinians didn't. That's why they don't have a state. Things could have been good. Could have been two-state wonderland. But Ben-Gurion is very explicit when he says that he accepted the partition plan as a first step towards the colonization and acquisition of the entirety of Palestine. A lot of times you hear the word authoritarian being like thrown around as a very bad thing, but Marx says that authoritarianism is just a facet of society, and you're either going to have the bourgeois as the authoritarian force or the proletariat as the authoritarian force. So basically what dictatorship of proletariat is sounds really scary. It just means working class democracy or workers' democracy. It means that the working class have seized the means of production. They are in charge of the government or the state as a tool towards class and stateless society, versus the bourgeoisie means workers are in control of government institutions, schools, newspapers, so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's like the idea of the dictatorship of like dictatorship of the majority instead of the dictatorship of the minority.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
And-
sorry, no, go.
No, I was gonna say, and David Ben-Gurion he said, I'm for the dictatorship of the proletariat in all cases except for Palestine. There, I'm in favor of the dictatorship of Zionism. And basically what he was saying is that, and Elon characterizes very accurately as opportunism. He basically throws away all of his Marxist beliefs when it comes to Palestine, and in this case prioritizes national interests over class interests.
Like as soon as it's inconvenient for him.
Exactly.
He'll side with the oppressor. And like along that tangent, this is kind of a tangent, but like, we have a lot to unlearn with with this kind of vocab, like dictatorship, authoritarian, because of how much Western media has just perpetrated, like lies, like just wrong shit all the time, like racist Orientalist propaganda against these words. And so this is a tangent, but like not what we're getting into, but like we have a lot to unlearn, and like I encourage you to always challenge anything you see in the media when it says authoritarian dictatorship. It's like, what does that actually mean? Is that propaganda? Is that an identifier of what this state looks like and how it operates? Or are we trying to like choke on racist information?
Here are these two very racist quotes from David Ben-Gurion and Golda Meir. Part of the propaganda that was used to legitimize this sort of labor Zionism is this idea that Palestinians or Arabs or Arabians didn't farm the land, they didn't cultivate the land, they were irresponsible when they lived on that land, they didn't do anything to till the land, and therefore it was the Jewish responsibility to come in and save the day, and uproot all those olive trees and replace them with pine trees, because that fucking works. So that was one of the main propaganda tools that they used, was claiming that Palestinians were irresponsible landowners, didn't know how to farm, didn't know how to cultivate their own indigenous land, which is, again, totally bananas. Something that persists even today is, I'm sure you all, I don't know if you have not heard specifically of the JNF. The JNF is the Jewish National Fund. They're an organization that basically sponsors the like plant a tree thing in Israel.
Oh my god, I know what that. Oh my
Yeah,
god.
60%. So what they do is they plant pine trees over decimated Palestinian farmland. They uproot olive trees and indigenous trees to do so. And 60% of the non-indigenous trees that they plant die within a few years. So it's very evident that this conception that Zionists and Jews, we know how to work the land, is totally false. Like,
Yeah, along that same note, like anytime protests or like movements are happening in Palestine, like so for example in Gaza right now, and like since the beginning of May of this year, the Great Return March, right? And so like youth have been burning tires, flying kites, and like starting fires and stuff to say like freaking stop this, and like so there's been like, you know, damage that they've been making is their stolen Israeli land. And so this same thread comes out like repeatedly with Israel. Like anytime Palestinians do anything in regards to the environment, they'll always be like, look at how much they're destroying the land, and like this environmentalist in me like comes out with them. It's like they're destroying their own land, and it's like, how many acres have you raised of trees, and like how many bulldozers are on Palestinian land right now?
farms,
Like how
exactly,
like how dare you say like a Palestinian kid flying a kite like that's set on fire over the land that he's supposed to be on is like ruining the environment, when like
love those good old
it's like
kites.
it's so it's so
Arson
dissonant.
kites.
Yeah, it's so dissonant, and like just keep paying attention in media, like that same motif will keep coming up. They'll keep using
This
that
is
same
really,
thing.
it's really shocking to see how these like very racist ideas continue to perpetuate into 2018. Even in the case of this Golda Meir quote, she says, you know, we will only have peace with the Arabs when they love their children more than they hate us. This is something that I've gone into debates with people this past year who have told me, oh, Gazans, they shouldn't have brought their children to the border. Even Abbas told them to leave their children at home. How much can they hate their children to bring them where tear gas is? Instead of saying, why are Israeli soldiers shooting tear gas into crowds where they know there are children?